When and why do you listen to music? For me, it's sometimes critical listening, but more often, music's just a soundtrack to life. Whether it's fun, relaxation, reflection, work, play, music just makes it all better for me. How about you? This is the WiiM Amp, and it seems to have been made exactly for this kind of use. It's a streamer, a DAC, and a relatively powerful speaker amp, all in what I think is not an unattractive box. It's controlled by a brilliant app. It's also got a remote that's voice controlled with Alexa if you're into that kind of thing. It's got normal buttons on the remote as well, of course. So basically, WiiM just took their Pro Plus streamer and jammed it in a box with a speaker amp. You're welcome. So it's got the feature set mostly nailed. It's got Bluetooth, it streams, it's got an analog input. If you've got something like a turntable, you will still need a phono preamp for it. It's got HDMI ARC if you want to use it to deliver your TV sound. I haven't tested that feature, and as far as I know, it doesn't do any surround sound, but if you just want quality 2-channel audio from your TV, then the WiiM Amp does that too. I've already said that the app is brilliant, and something else that I really like is the fact that the volume display on the front of the WiiM Amp is very simple, but it shows you everything you need to know. It uses 6 white LEDs, but that doesn't mean you've only got 6 steps of volume that you can see. Each of those LEDs is then independently dimmed, and so you can very quickly and easily get a sense of how much of the volume range you've used, and even more importantly, I think at least, when you're not using the volume control, when you're not actively adjusting it, you can have that go to sleep. So it's not blasting bright lights at you if you want a nice relaxed darkroom listening experience. But there is something we haven't spoken about yet. This is WiiM's first ever speaker amp. The TPA3255 Class D amp chip that they've used in here should sound okay, but the question for me was whether or not that makes it good enough to replace a separate setup of, say, a WiiM Pro or Pro Plus, combined maybe with an external DAC, a preamp, a power amp, or an integrated amplifier. In other words, a stack of separates doing the same job as the WiiM Amp. Yes, the WiiM Amp is cheap. Yes, the WiiM Amp is simple, being a single box solution, but is it good enough? Is it making you have to sacrifice sound quality to get a single box solution? Another question that sprung to mind is, why did WiiM choose the ES9018K2M DAC chip in the WiiM amplifier instead of the AK4493 DAC chip they use in the Pro Plus? And there's only one way to answer these questions, so let's dive into some comparisons. I took the WiiM Amp, which retails for $299, and I set it up in my living room with a pair of Monitor Audio Bronze 50 speakers. These retail for about $600, and connecting all of that up, I used $100 worth of world's best cable Canare speaker leads. So we've got a total system value here of about $1,000. Now, while we're talking about this setup, I should say a huge thanks to Radio Parts that sent out both the speakers and the WiiM Amp. They're a local online and bricks and mortar retailer of all sorts of electrical goods. So if you like what I've got to say about the WiiM Amp and the Monitor Audio Bronze 50s, which I'll be reviewing separately down the track, if you like what I've got to say about those, I'll put links through to Radio Parts in the description below just to say thank you to them for sending them out. But anyway, we've got $1,000 worth of speaker and amplifier setup in the WiiM Amp and the Bronze 50s, and then I put that up against my current living room system, which is the EverSolo DMP-A6. It's the non-master version. It comes in at $899, and that's fitting into an old set of Bang & Olufsen Beolab 3 speakers. The Beolab 3s retailed at about $2,200 when they were available, and they're also using Class D amplification, but they're an active speaker where the amplification is built into the speaker itself. So we've got my existing $3,100 system going up against a $1,000 system in the WiiM Amp and the Bronze 50s. On paper, this looks like a pretty easy win for the WiiM setup in the sense that it's so much cheaper, but it doesn't sound quite as good. The Beolab 3s and the DMP-A6 have a bit more clarity, a bit more life and energy to the sound, and the staging is a bit crisper and cleaner and better focused as well. That's taking into account the fact that the Beolab 3s I can get more width on, even if I put myself in the center sweet spot between these two systems. In both cases, the Beolab 3s and the DMP-A6 did come out ahead. But before you think that that's game over for the WiiM Amp, it's worth considering that there are a few factors involved here. We don't know yet if the weak link in the chain is the streamer, the DAC, the amplifiers, or the speakers themselves. Swapping the EverSolo in as the streamer and DAC for both setups, and what I mean by that is I had it running as the EverSolo DMP-A6 into the BLAB 3s, and then I also took an analog output from the DMP-A6 and fed that into the WiiM amp. So now what we've got is the DMP-A6 acting as both streamer and DAC for both setups, and I listened again, and I was really interested to hear the fact that the sound from the WiiM amp, DAC and streamer stages was preferable to me than the DMP-A6. In other words, I preferred the WiiM amp on its own, rather than the WiiM amp being fed by the DMP-A6. The EverSolo acting as streamer and DAC was a bit crisper, a bit brighter sounding, and overall a bit less enjoyable. It wasn't more detailed and resolving, it was just crisper and brighter. Of course, system synergy is always going to be a thing, and the DMP-A6 into the BLAB 3s is an absolute treat, but when it came to the WiiM amp, I was definitely preferring its inboard systems. And that shows us that the DAC stage and the streaming stage within the WiiM amp are definitely no slouch. So what is letting down this $1,000 setup when compared to the $3,000 setup? At the risk of upsetting some of you, I think it's actually the speaker cables. I'll tell you more about the Bronze 50s when I do their full review later, that's the speakers. But the short version of this is that when I've tested them in my office setup using a set of Tellurium Q Black 2 speaker cables, they're a far better speaker than I was hearing out in my living room setup. So I know that these speakers, and indeed this entire setup, has a lot more to give than what I was hearing in the living room, and that's where I took my testing back into my office to really see what the WiiM amp was capable of. My aim now was to isolate the quality of the speaker amp within the WiiM amp to see just how good it was. We'd already established the fact that the DAC and the streamer stage is up there with something like an EverSolo DMP-A6, and so if the speaker amp can hold its own as well, then suddenly we're talking about a really compelling product. I put the WiiM amp up against the SMSL AO200 Mk2, which is a $249 Class D amplifier, very similar to what's built in to the WiiM amp itself, and feeding both of them with the Chord Dave as my DAC, so in other words a really high-end input source, feeding both of them and comparing them, there is no tonal difference between the two, as you'd kind of expect, but it's still interesting to know. However, things change a bit when we look a bit deeper. The WiiM amp has crisper leading edges of notes, the transients feel a bit better defined, and the end result is a sound that's a bit more energetic, a bit more dynamic, but not harsher. There's just more sense of articulation and a better overall sense of definition to the sound. In contrast, the AO200 Mk2 comes across sounding a little bit muted. Sounds like acoustic guitars are more lifelike and more energetic. There's a sense of articulation to them from the WiiM amp that the AO200 Mk2 can't quite keep up with. Likewise, listening to Yes We Can by Harry Connick Jr., there's some horn blast in this track that just come to life on the WiiM amp and don't quite get there on the AO200 Mk2, which is a solid Class D amplifier, but not on the level of the WiiM amp. Perhaps it's the difference between the MA5332 chip that's used to amplify the sound in the AO200 versus the TPA3255 chip in the WiiM amp. I'm not sure. Whatever it is, it's a clear difference. One area that was a bit harder to assess was the staging and imaging between these two setups. There was quite a long delay as I switched between the two amplifiers each time, so that was hard to assess, but I'm fairly confident, like 90% confident, that the WiiM amp had the edge there as well. I feel like the sounds were more separated and more clearly defined in space. And that would make sense if things like transients and leading edges of notes are better defined. That's all the stuff that our brain actually needs to piece together a good sonic image. And in fact, at this point, I was so impressed with the WiiM amp that I decided to put it up against a ridiculous competition in the form of the Enlium Amp 23R. Now we're talking about $6,000 worth of speaker amp. It's also a headphone amp. It's just a pure amplifier. It doesn't do anything else that the WiiM amp does. But I just wanted to see how good the WiiM amp really was. And the scary thing is, it was actually going neck and neck with the Enlium Amp 23R. With a caveat. The caveat is that the Monitor Audio Bronze 50s are an entry-level speaker, maybe a step above entry-level, but they're still an affordable speaker. If you put the Enlium Amp 23R with higher-end gear, specifically higher-end speakers, it can do more. But the point of all this is to say that if you're just looking for a budget to mid-level speaker setup, the WiiM amp is absolutely going to get the most out of any speakers in this $600, probably up to about $1,000 range. It's a brilliant amp, and it just so happens to be paired up with a brilliant DAC, streamer, application, etc. And so in short, the WiiM amp is a home run for WiiM, and that makes it a home run for those of us that like to live our lives with music. The WiiM amp is not going to match a dedicated 2-channel critical listening setup. One with a separate streamer, a separate DAC, a separate amp, maybe an integrated or a preamp power amp combo, and a great set of speakers. But that's not what it's here for. What it's here for is to be a cheaper, easier to use, easier to set up, more compact system that's also got really high Wi-Fi acceptance factor because it's small and not unattractive. It also requires just a single remote or a single app on your phone. You're not having to interact with multiple different devices to get your music started. And for me, that makes the WiiM Amp the cheapest and easiest way to bring great music into your life so you can focus on living. If that sounds good to you, I'll put some links down below where you can click through and grab a WiiM Amp for yourself. I highly recommend it. Again, thank you to Radio Parts for sending it out. If you're here in Australia, please consider buying from them to say thank you as well. And while we're on the thanks, thank you to channel members, thank you to Patreon members, and thanks to all of you that send through super thanks here on YouTube. Your support is always deeply appreciated. Finally, if you enjoyed this video, try this one up here next. And for now, happy listening, be kind to each other, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.